David stepped out of the sleek black car that had just dropped him home from the airport. He took a deep breath, feeling the warm air of home after years away. Just as he was about to grab his bags, a soft voice caught his attention. "Welcome, sir. Glad you had a safe trip," said a young woman, hurrying to the trunk of the car. David turned and froze for a moment. She wasn't someone he recognized. She had a simple but pretty face, her hair tied back neatly, and she moved quickly as she pulled his luggage from the car. There was something about her that made his heart skip a beat. "Thank you," he said, a little unsure why her presence had caught him so off guard. She nodded politely and carried his bags inside without hesitation. David found himself staring after her, confused. "Why is my heart racing?" he thought, shaking his head as he walked inside. After his shower, David came down to the dining room, following the delicious aroma of his favorite meal. His mood had brightened a little, but the thought of the maid still lingered in his mind. When he sat at the table, there she was again, carefully placing the dishes in front of him. He couldn't help but stare at her as she moved. Her every step seemed graceful, and her presence filled the room in a way he couldn't explain. "Thank you," he said suddenly. "What's your name?" The maid glanced up at him, a little surprised. "I'm Linda, sir. You're welcome," she said softly, then smiled politely. David smiled back. "Linda, that's a beautiful name. And wow, I didn't know our maid was so..." He stopped himself, feeling a little shy. "So, kind and talented. The food smells amazing." Linda blushed slightly and gave a small laugh. "Thank you, sir." "Please call me David," he said firmly. "Enough of the sad business." Linda froze, her expression unsure. "I'm sorry, sir. I mean, she stuttered. "I don't think that's appropriate. You're my boss." David frowned, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. It's just a name. I insist." Her cheeks turned red, but she nodded reluctantly. "All right, David." David grinned, pleased, while Linda hurried back to the kitchen. She was quiet as she cleaned up, her mind racing. Why is he being so friendly? She wondered. This feels like something out of a movie. Meanwhile, David ate in silence. Though his thoughts were loud, he couldn't stop thinking about her, how she moved, how her voice sounded, how her smile made him feel something he hadn't felt before. David had returned home because his parents insisted it was time for him to settle down. They had been pressurizing him for months to live his life abroad and return to meet the woman they had chosen for him. His last relationship had ended badly, leaving him heartbroken, so he had finally agreed to come back. That evening, his parents arrived home with Sandra, the woman they wanted him to marry. She was stunning, tall, with flawless skin, long flowing hair, and a confident smile. She greeted David warmly, her voice smooth and sweet. David smiled politely, but inside, he felt nothing. Sandra was everything a man could want: smart, well-dressed, and charming. But as she talked, David's mind drifted. He kept picturing Linda, the way her hands moved when she served food, the way her voice softened when she said his name. Sandra, on the other hand, seemed to notice his lack of interest. She remained calm and composed, thinking to herself, maybe he just needs time. She had been raised to be patient and understanding, so she chose not to push him. But deep down, she couldn't help but feel disappointed. As the days passed, David found it harder to hide his feelings. His parents were thrilled about Sandra, but he was distant and absent-minded whenever they brought her around. At dinners, he barely joined the conversations, and when Sandra tried to get to know him better, his answers were short and vague. "David, are you even listening?" his mother snapped one evening as they sat at the table with Sandra. Yes, sorry," David mumbled, glancing at Sandra, who gave him a small, understanding smile. Sandra didn't complain, but she noticed how his eyes often wandered. He was polite but detached, and no matter how hard she tried to connect with him, he seemed far away. In truth, David wasn't far away. He was in the kitchen. He found himself spending more and more time there, drawn to Linda like a moth to a flame. At first, Linda tried to keep her distance, afraid of what his parents might think if they found out he's always with her in the kitchen. "Mr. David, you shouldn't be here," she said one afternoon as she chopped vegetables. "What if your parents sees you?" "So what if they do?" David replied with a shrug, leaning against the counter. "I just want to help. Is that a crime?" "You don't belong in the kitchen," Linda said firmly, avoiding his gaze. "It's not right." "Who says?" David shot back. "Besides, I like being here with you." Linda quickly turned away to focus on her work, but David didn't leave. He stayed, asking her questions about her life, her family, her favorite things. Despite his growing feelings for Linda, David never confessed. He was afraid of what his parents would do if they found out. He couldn't bear the thoughts of Linda losing her job, or worse, being humiliated because of him. So instead, he kept his feelings to himself, though his actions spoke louder than words. One day, he decided to confront his parents. It was a tense conversation. "Mom, Dad," he said, his voice firm, "I can't marry Sandra." His mother's face hardened instantly. "What are you saying, David? She's perfect for you. The wedding is already being planned." I'm sorry, but I don't feel anything for her," David replied. "I can't marry someone I don't love." His mother's eyes narrowed. "Then who do you want to love, David?" "Some classless girl, I suppose." David froze, suspecting maybe his mother already knew about his feelings for Linda. His father chimed in, his voice cold and sharp. "If you don't marry Sandra, you're on your own. We won't support you." David swallowed hard, torn between his love for Linda and his loyalty for his parents. In the end, he stayed silent. He couldn't bring himself to hurt Linda by starting something that had no future. The wedding preparation continued, and the closer the day came, the heavier David's heart grew. He went through the motions, but his mind was always with Linda. Sandra, meanwhile, did her best to win his affection, but she could see the pain in his eyes. On the day of the wedding, the hall was breathtaking. Flowers adorned every corner, and the guests were dressed in their finest. But as Sandra stood at the altar, holding David's hand, she hesitated. The preacher's voice echoed through the room. "I, Sandra Akinpelu, take you, David, to be my husband." But Sandra didn't repeat the words. Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but nothing came out. Her hands trembled in David's grip, and her chest tightened under the weight of the moment. The silence stretched on, rippling through the grand hall, as curious murmurs began to spread among the guests. Sandra's mind was spinning. The vows felt too heavy to speak, too final to commit to. She glanced at David, his face calm but distant, and a deep sadness settled in her heart. He doesn't love me. He never has. Over the past weeks, she had tried everything to earn his affection, patience, understanding, even ignoring the cold way he often avoided her presence. But the truth had become clearer with every passing day. David's heart was not hers. And now, standing before hundreds of well-dressed dignitaries, family friends, and her own parents, Sandra couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Can I really spend the rest of my life in a loveless marriage? She thought, her throat tightening. She had read countless books and heard endless advice about love and marriage. One thing remained constant. Love was supposed to be the foundation. It wasn't something you could fake or force, no matter how perfect things seemed on the surface. She looked around the hall. The room was breathtaking, draped in white and gold, with fresh flowers adorning every corner. Guests in designer outfits sat in awe, their eyes fixed on the couple at the altar. Her parents, beaming with pride, sat in the front row, their expectations hanging heavily in the air. This day was everything they had ever dreamed of for her. But Sandra's joy was nowhere to be found. Her mind raced. If I say these vows, am I condemning myself to a life of emptiness? But if I walk away, I will shame my family. I will disappoint everyone here. What do I do? Her knees felt weak as her gaze swept over the crowd again. She noticed the William family looking proud and satisfied, entirely confident that this union would seal their family's partnership. She spotted her mother, smiling nervously as if to encourage her. The weight of everyone's hopes pressed down on Sandra, and for a moment, she felt like she might crumble. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. What's worse, betraying myself or betraying my family? Her breath hitched as she looked back at David. He was watching her, but his expression gave nothing away. There was no warmth, no love, no anticipation in his eyes, only the polite indifference she had come to know. It hit her like a wave. She couldn't do it. She couldn't marry a man who didn't love her, no matter how perfect the wedding looked or how much it pleased their families. But the fear of what would happen if she backed out now gripped her, freezing her in place. Sandra's voice trembled as she finally spoke. I, but the rest of the words refused to come. The silence in the room deepened. All eyes were on her, waiting, wondering, judging. The preacher cleared his throat awkwardly, glancing between Sandra and David. Sandra could feel the weight of every stare, every expectation suffocating her. She looked down, her thoughts a whirlwind. Do I say the words just to get through this day? Or do I risk everything for a chance at true happiness? Sandra couldn't decide. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest as she stood frozen at the altar, the decision hanging in the balance. The hall was heavy with silence, every eye fixed on Sandra as she stood frozen at the altar. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and panic set in. Sandra's parents exchanged confused glances, her mother's expression shifting quickly from worry to embarrassment. She could feel the weight of every guest's gaze boring into her. Her chest tightened with anxiety, and her thought was wide. What is she doing? Why is she taking so long? Sandra's mother clenched her fist, her nails digging into her palms. This girl better not embarrass me in front of all these people. Dignitaries, family friends, how dare she drag this out? David's parents, seated in the front row, glanced at each other with furrowed brows. Mr. Williams whispered to his wife, "What's going on? Is something wrong with Sandra?" "I don't know," Mrs. Williams replied, trying to mask her unease. Sandra's father leaned closer to his wife. "You better get this under control." He hissed through clenched teeth, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. In the midst of the tension, Sandra felt moved. She raised her trembling hand to take the microphone. The room felt its breath. But instead of speaking into the mic, she turned slightly to David and leaned in close, whispering softly into his ear. "What do you think? Do you think Sandra will say yes or walk away? Watch out for part 2.